Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Election Countdown. It's part of our voter game plan virtual event series. I'm Austin Cross. I'm the host of Early All Things Considered here on KPCC. And I don't think I need to tell you this, but this is really an election year unlike any other, right? And a lot of LA County voters have already taken it upon themselves to vote early this year. According to Registrar Dean Logan, as of Tuesday of this week, 1,126,765 ballots have been received so far. And then there's the rest of us who maybe haven't had time to sit down and go through our ballots. And if that's you, no shame, no shame. I'm not blaming you or anything. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to get you a lot of important information about some props and races that you're going to see on your ballot. Now, we won't have time to get to all of them, but we tried to choose the ones that people might have had a lot of questions about. So feel free to take out your ballot now if it's nearby and follow along. And without any further ado, I want to bring in a familiar face for KPCC politics watchers, our very own senior politics reporter, Libby Denkmann. Hey, Libby.
Hey, Austin. So happy to be here doing this with you.
It's an exciting time, and let's kick things right off here so
For
we can get
sure.
on to the debate, which I'm sure is going to be a very interesting show all its own. And we're going to start today with the LA County District Attorney's race. Now, for those people who haven't been following the race, some quick background for you. The DA's office prosecutes everything from misdemeanors to felonies. Now, it's a nonpartisan office, but this year it's attracted a lot of national attention, especially amid a debate over police killings and calls for DAs to prosecute more cops. Now, it's a race between incumbent Jackie Lacey and former San Francisco DA George Gascon. He was reelected to his position as DA in 2015, but then he stepped down last fall to run here. So, Libby, let's just take a little look at these candidates here because people are really passionate about this race. And let's start with Jackie Lacey. What do
Yeah,
people need to
that's
know?
that's definitely an understatement, Austin. I mean, passion and just a ton of eyes on this race. Jackie Lacey is running for her third term, leading the largest prosecutor's office in the country. She identifies herself as a reasonable reformer. She says that she started a mental health diversion program. That's an example of reasonable reformer steps that she's taken as head of the department. She's a career prosecutor. She came up through the ranks of the department. She was handpicked by the last DA to succeed him. She's the first Black woman to hold the role, and she has a lot of loyalty from rank and file prosecutors in the department. But she's also been hammered by community groups who say she's gone easy on law enforcement who have killed Black and brown men in Los Angeles. I mean, you've probably seen weekly Black Lives Matter LA and other groups are outside her office, rain or shine. For years now, they've been holding those protests. One specific case that gets brought up again and again is Brendan Glenn, who was killed in Venice in 2015. And this was a case where the then chief of police, Charlie Beck, had said that he wanted to see charges filed against the officer who killed Brendan Glenn. And Jackie Lacey decided that she didn't think she could win the case, that the officers could reasonably argue that he was defending his own life or the life of his partner. And so she declined to charge. She has charged one sheriff's deputy with a shooting in the line of duty. And that's more than her opponent in this race. George Gascon has not charged any law enforcement officer with a shooting. So, she says that he has, in her words, snookered the activists by pointing to his record in San Francisco, even though he has not actually filed any charges. But George Gascon did take part in a statewide reform legislation and crafting that legislation to limit the circumstances in which law enforcement can use deadly force. So he argues that though he didn't file charges, he has been part of reform efforts.
And you did mention quite a bit about Gascon there, and he's garnered a number of endorsements here now from people like Gavin Newsom, Mayor Eric Garcetti, former LA Police Chief Charlie Beck, who you mentioned, even the LA Times, and it's a really heavy list of endorsements. So I'm wondering, what is it that people have maybe said about why they're endorsing Gascon over Lacey this time around?
Well, it's interesting. There was a few Democrats earlier in the summer who decided to make the shift. You saw Adam Schiff, some local state legislators deciding to step back, revoke their endorsement of Lacey, and go with Gascon. Gascon is the co-author of Prop 47, a statewide proposition that reduced some nonviolent felonies to misdemeanors. And, I think that there has been this sea change in the way that we see prosecutors' offices, and we're seeing it nationwide. Chicago, Boston. There's been cities across the country, Philadelphia, who have elected progressive prosecutors, and that's seen as sort of the top-down approach to affecting criminal justice reform. And I think that here in Los Angeles, there's been a lot of political calculation that this is the way the wind is shifted, and it's time to move that direction. One interesting one that I saw, Austin, was Herb Wesson, who is running for Los Angeles County Supervisors District 2. He revoked his endorsement of Lacey, but he did not endorse Gascon. So he's sort of, holding back and saying he wants to focus on his own race. But it certainly seems to be a political time of shifting and reevaluating old alliances.
Well, thank you for that, Libby. Well, let's now change gears a little bit so we can look at the LA County Board of Supervisors race. And the supervisors have sometimes been referred to as the five little kings or queens, given all the power that they wield. And they do oversee a $35 billion budget. It's quite hefty. Now, this is a race for the second supervisor seat, and it's held right now by Mark Ridley Thomas, who's termed out. It includes cities like Carson, Compton, Culver City, and Inglewood. About 2 million residents call that district their home right now. So competing for the seat is State Senator Holly Mitchell and termed out City Council member Herb Wesson. First off, Libby, just this last week, you hosted a debate, as luck would have it, between Mitchell and Wesson. How would you describe their platforms?
Yeah, I just mentioned Wesson in terms of his endorsement, pulling his endorsement of Jackie Lacey. Wesson has been a political heavyweight in Los Angeles for many years. He was the council president, the city council president, and before that, the speaker of the state assembly. He really touts his work shepherding through legislation like raising the minimum wage in Los Angeles to $15 an hour, Proposition HHH, which is, funding housing for the homeless, consolidating city elections into the same time as state and federal elections, which is a big deal in local politics. And he also talks about his recent work, Austin, in terms of police reform. He was one of the city council members who introduced the measure to remove $150 million of funding from the LAPD, which compared to their overall operating budget is really small amount, but it was a symbolic move according to activists. He's also gained the endorsement through his work with community activists during this time, since George Floyd was killed by Minneapolis police. He's gained the endorsement of Black Lives Matter LA co-founder Melina Abdullah, Pete White with LA Can, these really major community leaders. And so, I think that Herb Wesson is somebody who has been in city politics for a long time, but he's also shown that he's able to evolve and really capture this moment as well, and capture support during this moment.
I got you. And what should we know about Holly Mitchell?
Sure. She used to be the CEO of Crystal Stairs, which is a child and family wellness nonprofit. And then she joined the legislature, the assembly, and then the state senate. She's the chair of the budget committee in the state senate. And she really touts efforts for families and children. She worked to eliminate the maximum family grant rule in CalWORKs, which was seen as a discriminatory rule. And it really did deny cash assistance to a lot of even just babies who were born that weren't getting cash assistance under CalWORKs because their families were already receiving state aid. She also touts her work on criminal justice reform. And in her words, she's been doing it since before it was cool, sort of dinging her opponent there on maybe engaging in some political opportunism. She worked to ban life sentences for juveniles. She worked on shrinking the sentence differential between powder and crack cocaine, limiting what police can seize when people have not been convicted of a crime. So she touts, her work on the budget committee, but then also her work in criminal justice reform for sure.
Really quickly, Libby, before we move on, I'm just wondering, based off of your conversation, if you saw any one clear difference between the two candidates and maybe the biggest contrast that you noticed there.
I would say the biggest flashpoint during the debate that I moderated last week was Charter Amendment C. And that is something that Herb Wesson supported in 2017. And it was a measure that gave LAPD officers who are facing discipline the option to face an all civilian review panel. And, advocates at the time, groups that were pushing for criminal justice reform, said that civilians rule in favor of police officers more often than experienced members of the command staff, which is what they would face before. Critics also said that this was a piece of legislation that was cooked up by LAPD unions, and it really wasn't something that should have been passed at the time. Herb Wesson defended his work on that, and he said that he's worked with the ACLU to tweak the legislation since it was passed. But, Holly Mitchell certainly said this is an example of Herb Wesson, working with the police unions in the past to go more easily on police officers who are facing discipline.
Well, thank you for that, Libby. I want to move quickly now to some important congressional races. We're going to focus on two of them that are happening here in Southern California. And depending on where you, the people who are viewing this, live, you might see one or none of these options on your ballot. And I really want to start with District 25 in northern LA County. If you live there, you probably know a lot about its history already. It's a very purple district, and it's had a very interesting past few years when it comes to leadership. And so I want to focus then on Republican Mike Garcia. He won the race in May of this year, and then Democratic Assemblywoman Christy Smith is running against him now. What do we need to know about the candidates and what they stand for, Libby?
Sure. This was Katie Hill's old seat, and then she flipped it from the Republicans in 2018 in the blue wave, and then she, of course, stepped down amidst a lot of stuff going on in terms of nude photos being released, and then also a potential investigation into an inappropriate relationship with a congressional staffer. So constituents here have been through a real roller coaster. I mean, they're looking at these two candidates, Assemblymember Christy Smith, who's a Democrat, and the sitting congressman now, Mike Garcia, whom you mentioned won the special election back in May. On most issues, there's just a huge gulf between these two candidates. I mean, Mike Garcia in a debate this week said you can drive a truck through the differences between these two candidates. Mike Garcia wants to repeal the Affordable Care Act, although he says he wants to do it once Republicans have a plan for replacing it. He argues that businesses and schools need to reopen more quickly after COVID-19. He argues that the state has too much control over which businesses and schools in the Antelope Valley, Simi Valley, that North LA County, Eastern Ventura County area, what they're doing. And, Christy Smith is, touting her support for the Affordable Care Act, and healthcare, of course, was a huge winner for Democrats in the midterms, and they expect it to be again. One thing that I found interesting was their differences on talking about the wildfires that have ravaged that region lately, the Bobcat fire being the most recent, but there's been a number of evacuations of neighborhoods in the Antelope Valley and Santa Clarita. And you just are struck listening to these two candidates. Christy Smith will talk about climate change and the effects of climate change on making fires more, rapid to spread and more intense. And Mike Garcia says she's burying her head in the sand, and that really what everyone needs to focus on is forest management and getting, federal help in terms of resources to fight the fires. Now, Smith agrees that you need resources to fight the fires, but Garcia really tries to thread that needle of a politician who is a big supporter of President Trump, who doesn't necessarily believe in the science of climate change, and also realizing that he is running in a purple district where the majority of his constituents will believe in climate change and believe that it is an existential threat to their livelihoods and their homes. So it's just a really fascinating race to watch, and I think it's going to be really close this time.
I'm really curious before we move on, Libby, because I actually spent a lot of time covering District 25. I spoke to Steve Knight, who was in before Katie Hill. I followed Katie Hill before a lot of people knew her name and saw all the grassroots effort and organizing that was behind her. And then she won, and then a Republican won this time around. And I'm wondering, is there any thought as to what happened, what was different this time around that caused a Republican to win for, I believe it's the first time since 1998, a Republican beat out a Democrat on that level?
Yeah, you know, the activists I spoke to and the people who observed this race think that the Katie Hill resignation just really took the wind out of the sails of folks, the liberals in the 25th district, that they were hugely pumped about flipping that district for the Democrats. And then seeing Katie leave in that way, just it was really hard for them, and it was hard for them to get motivated for that special election. A special election will always have greater Republican turnout. That's generally the rule of thumb. But yeah, I think that there was a real sense of disappointment and resignation, and hard to get people's enthusiasm back up after what happened with Katie.
Gotcha. Well, we're just past the halfway mark here, so I'm going to pick up the pace here because you've got so much great information. But I know that people gotta get out of here soon
I
to
need
watch
to
that
talk
debate.
less.
Oh, it's so much good information, Libby. I tell you, it's great. You're a treasure to all of us, I believe. And I want to look at another congressional race real quick. It's the District 48 in Orange County, and that's Democrat Harley Ruda. He beat out incumbent Dana Rohrabacher, who'd been there for a very long time. And Ruda is a former Republican. He's a pretty wealthy real estate executive, and his opponent is pretty formidable too. Who's he up against right now? And what are the biggest differences between them and what they stand for?
Yeah, Michelle Steele is his opponent, who's an Orange County supervisor, and she's very connected to Republican politics. Her husband, Sean Steele, used to be the chair of the Republican Party in the state of California. And she's very well known in the district. I think that she, as a Korean American politician, connects with a good portion of that district. The district's about 15 or 16% Asian American. And that district is still about 5 points leaning Republican in terms of registration. So Harley Ruda is expected to have one of the hardest times in terms of keeping his seat that was won by Democrats in the blue wave.
Got you. Thank you for that. Well, now is the portion that I'm going to call the rapid fire section of our chat. And we're going to focus in on some very important propositions and measures showing up on the ballot. And just a reminder, if you're just tuning in, we're not going to have time to get through all 12 of them. So we've selected just a few of the ones that people have had a lot of questions about. And this is also a good time to say that if you'd like more information on all those ballot measures, of course, you can check out our website. That's votergameplan.com. I'm going to kick this one off, Libby, looking at Prop 16, and that would repeal a statewide ban on affirmative action. It's been in place for about 25 years now. So what do people need to know about this one?
Right. So Prop 16 would repeal Prop 209, which was passed by voters in 1996. You may remember it was in the wake of Prop 187, which was trying to deny benefits to immigrants who are in the country without authorization. Prop 209 was sort of part of that wave of conservative, reactionary propositions that passed in California, and the legacy of which still echoes today in our politics. There's research showing that 209 did have a detrimental effect on the number of people of color who are present in the UC system. If 209 is repealed, so if Proposition 16 passes, public institutions, so the government, the state government, University of California, these kind of entities can use admissions and hiring a person's race, sex, ethnicity, or national origin. So this is something that will open the door to affirmative action in California again, which has been banned since that vote in 96. I want to note that it does not apply to private businesses, and it affects, hiring and school admissions. But one thing that has been overturned by courts and banned by courts in the past is the idea of quotas. And I think a lot of people who are on the other side of this and oppose this proposition fear the idea of quotas as coming into school admissions and government hiring practices. But that is something that courts have said is not okay in the past. Surprisingly, even with this wave of racial reckoning in this country, in California, the Proposition 16 is still polling behind. And I think its supporters are a little bit surprised that it didn't have more juice in the tank. They're trying to run more ads. They're trying to do more messaging behind it. But for right now, Prop 16 passing, it's definitely not a sure thing. And so the question of whether California will bring back affirmative action in hiring and admissions, that's still open.
Thank you for that. Let's look now at Proposition 21, just moving ahead a little bit, and that would expand local government's power to pass rent control laws. What do people need to know about that one, Libby?
Sure. So this probably feels like deja vu. I don't know if you remember way back to 2018, Austin. Can you remember
Deja
that far
vu all
back?
over again. I do. It was like
Yeah.
5 years ago, right?
It was so long ago. I feel like it was 20 years ago. So we, as voters, the collective we, uh, voted against a similar measure in 2018. It's back on the ballot this time. Basically, it would uh, expand the ability of cities and local governments to pass rent control. So under a current law called the Costa-Hawkins Act, California cities cannot enact rent control on any buildings occupied after February 1995. And in Los Angeles, it's actually an earlier date. It's October 1978. So, the rent control can only be enacted on buildings that are older than 1978, which is a pretty strict limit in Los Angeles. And current law also says that a landlord can raise rents to market rate if tenants move out. So, besides that, if you follow the date cutoff and everything, cities can pass rent control laws. Now, also, there was a rent control statewide law that was recently passed. So that made it illegal for residential landlords to raise rent more than 5%. And adding to that local inflation rate. So the whole state now has a limited version of rent control for buildings that are older than 15 years. Now, if Proposition 21 passes, cities aren't necessarily going to pass rent control, but they may. So it opens the door for that.
Got you. Well, let's move on now to Proposition 22. It's a big one here in California. I'm sure we've seen signs. There's just been a lot on Proposition 22 out there. And essentially, it would classify people who work for app-based companies, think Uber, think Lyft, as independent contractors. But this one, Libby, actually has some long history, and we're going to try to get it in because we're just passing about the 7-8 minute mark left on our program right now. But how did Prop 22 come about? And what are kind of the arguments on both sides for that right now?
Yeah, this is such a huge deal. And you can see it based on the number of ads that you're getting in mailers and everything like that. This is in response to AB 5, a statewide piece of legislation the House and Senate passed in Sacramento, which was in turn in response to a statewide Supreme Court decision called Dynamex. Now, Dynamex said that employees, gig workers, had to be classified as full-time employees if they passed a 3-part test. And that was that workers, they can be classified as independent contractors if they passed a 3-part test. And that is, workers must be free from control and direction of employers. They must do work that is outside the usual course of the company's business, and they have to have an independent business of their own in the same industry. So those were the workers that qualified as independent contractors. Everyone else in the gig economy world would have to be classified as employees. Now, of course, this threw a lot of industries into a tizzy. A lot of people protested. You saw writers and people who were typically freelance photographers or things like that in Los Angeles area protesting. The legislature went back and created more loopholes last year to AB 5, and that was to exempt people like writers and photographers. But they very specifically did not exempt gig workers, so people who drive for Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, all of these app-based delivery companies. So immediately, Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, everybody else began a campaign to fight AB 5. They did not comply with the law. They went to court. They've been granted an injunction where they don't have to comply until after the election. And they launched Prop 22, which is just this massive effort to try to carve out an exception in AB 5 that applies solely to gig workers, app-based drivers.
Got you. Thank you again for that, Libby. Now is the portion where we're going to actually move on to some of the listener questions that we've gotten. We've gotten some of these questions a few times, so I just want to get them out there because I'm guessing that a lot of other people have these questions. And the first one comes down to ballots, and it's what happens if I don't include my address on my ballot envelope? What then, Libby?
If you don't include your address, you should be fine. I mean, really, the most important thing is that you include your signature. The address is not something that the registrar needs in order to confirm that it's you. They use that signature to compare it against what they have on file. They have your address. That's how you got your ballot, likely in the first place. But if you do fill it out, great. But if you don't fill it out, it's likely fine. And remember, if your ballot gets rejected for any reason, your registrar has to contact you to let you fix it by state law.
So another question, which might be along the same vein, is if you make a mistake on your ballot, then what do you do?
So it depends on what kind of mistake. If you make a
Of
mistake,
course.
say writing the date on the return envelope, or if you are worried about something that you did a little mismark, here or there, usually it's okay if you very clearly cross out a decision that you've made, you fill in the right one. That will likely have to be hand counted, so it may take a little bit longer. But if you fear at all that your choices may be misconstrued or there is just some major mistake that you made, you can contact your registrar, ask for a new ballot, or you can go in person. The in-person voting is going to start this Saturday on the 24th. And you know, that's a really great option. I think if you have any questions at all, just go in person. The Vote Center folks can help you.
There's another question about signatures that have maybe changed since the last time a person registered to vote. I know that that might actually be a question. Like for my wife, we were recently married not that long ago, and sometimes things change on applications. What do people need to know if there was a change like that in between?
Well, unfortunately, there is no way to check your signature on file with your registrar. It's simply just not a service that they offer. So typically, if you're able to re-register with your new signature, your new information, that would be registering by mail because you'd have to have a new signature on the filing, or you'd have to go in person to the registrar's office in LA or Orange County or whatever county you're in. The most important thing is registrars have your driver's license signature on file. And so if your wife got a new driver's license with her new signature, they should have that change of name and signature. But re-registering is probably the safest way. And unfortunately, that will probably mean either going in person or doing it by mail so that you can get that signature updated.
I think this is a question that a good handful of people might have, but if they have a family member who's maybe out of the state or country, who maybe asks them to send in their ballot for them, maybe fill it out and send it in for them, is that legal? Can they do that?
You can't fill out a ballot for somebody else. So no,
Important.
that's not something you can do. You can send that ballot to that person and hopefully they can mail it back and you can submit it for them. That is completely legal and something that California allows you to do. So there's a section on your ballot envelope to fill out if you are designating somebody else to turn in your vote for you. But no, you cannot fill out a ballot for somebody else. That's not legal.
It's very important. Is there anything last minute, Libby, that you think people should be thinking about as they prepare their ballots, as they prepare to turn them in?
Boy, just if you have any questions at all, you can contact us at the Voter Game Plan. You can ask questions, go in person, go early. The earlier you vote, the more likely you're going to feel more comfortable. You're not going to face any kind of crowds. You're going to have time to talk to election staff if you choose to go in person. And I just think it's the best option. If you're not voting by mail, go early if you go in person.
Well, we got through it, and I want to thank everybody for joining us for Election Countdown today, just right ahead of the timer here and the debate that's about to happen. And you can, of course, remember to sign your ballots. That's a very important one. And if you need more information on the props and the races, as Libby mentioned, votergameplan.com Very important. Lots of great resources there. Now, we're not currently able to convene in the Crawford Family Forum, which I'm sure a good handful of you have maybe gone to our events there, but we do want to acknowledge Gordon and Donna Crawford for making our virtual programming possible. And of course, finally, Libby, thank you so much for being here and giving us the information, so much good information that we need during what could be one of the most important elections in our history.
Thanks, Austin. It's always fun to work with you.
Well, a full video of tonight's event can be found on our event page soon, so feel free to come back and share it with anybody that couldn't join us this evening. And if you like what you heard here, it's pitch week, it's pledge week, so it's important. If you want to appreciate your pals here at KPCC and you're able to give, please make a donation. You are the financial wind beneath our wings. The presidential debate kicks off soon, so have a good night, everybody.